I'm in the process of, I'm trying to make myself think thoughts I once thought in the hope of thinking them differently as a way to hopefully understand what I thought. And this is part of what I've done. A person called How I Think I Learned to Think Theologically on Practical Reasons. And I've done one called How We Taught by the Holy Spirit. And allegedly, I don't have a doctrine of the Holy Spirit. And I've got one called How to Tell Time Theologically, and How to Write a Theological Sentence, which I highlight Robert Jensen's great sentence, God is whoever raised Jesus from the dead, having first raised Israel from Egypt. I've got, and so anyway, so this is part of that project. I confess my first reaction to the theme, the place of theology and ministry, was one of disorientation. What has happened that we now need to ask what role theology might have for those in the ministry? I've always assumed that theology and ministry were joined at the hip. You cannot have one without the other. Of course, everything depends on what you understand theology to be, as well as what you think ordination entails for those that bear the title of priest. My disorientation can be illustrated by a story Methodists tell to suggest their confusion about the relation of theology and the ministry. I like the story very much, but I'm not prepared to stand behind its veracity. It may, in general, be true, but some of the details may not be quite right. The story goes like this. An elderly Methodist minister was attending what Methodists in America call an annual conference. This was a man who, over many years, had faithfully obeyed his bishop. That meant he had been moved to one church after another in the state of New York. He was not a scholar, but he was a good minister. This annual conference was embroiled in a theological debate concerning whether a theologian who taught at the seminary at Boston University should be disciplined because he did not believe in original sin. The debate raged on for some time, which tried the patience of our elderly pastor. Finally, unable to listen to one more argument for or against original sin, he rose declaring that he had had it with all this theological hair-splitting. After all, he said, little depends on theological opinions because, as we all know, most of theology is blind. What they must do, he argued, is forget theology and preach Christ and Him crucified. It is well known fact that Methodists are not a people with a gift for irony. This elderly minister seems to represent an extreme example of the absence of irony among Methodists. It surely did not occur to him that to preach Christ and Him crucified represented a strong theological claim with profound moral and political implications. His intervention reflected the general presumption among Americans that theology was not all that important for the everyday life of a minister or a priest or the people they serve. The elderly gentleman's comments may even suggest that theology may even be dangerous for those who are in the ministry. Thus, the oft-made comment that this or that person who was going into the ministry was quite promising before going to seminary, where the courses he or she took made the ministerial candidates so confused they could not seek ordination. I'm not sure where to begin if the given task is to convince ministers that the ministry cannot be made intelligible without theological rationale. I feel somewhat like the Texas football coach at a high school team who found themselves behind at halftime 72-0. The coach walked into the locker room holding the football over his head and said, "Gentlemen, we need to start at the beginning. This is a football." I'm not sure if we are behind 72-0, but it is not clear to me how to even start trying to show the role theology should have for the priesthood. I'm quite appreciative, however, that the question of the place of theology in the ministry may well reflect the loss of an educated public that seems to have little, if any, knowledge of the basis of the Christian faith. My dean, Richard Hayes, tells the story of his recent visit to Western Australia to attend the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature. He found himself on a bus sitting next to a person who asked him why he had come to Australia. He explained he had come for a conference of people who studied the New Testament. After a long pause, his seatmate asked, "The New Testament, does that have anything to do with religion?" You need to be careful using such examples because they can invite presumption that in the past Christians and non-Christians were more knowledgeable about what made them Christians than in fact they were. Yet it's also the case that many Christians and non-Christians currently have little idea of what makes Christianity tick. There was a time, let us call it Christendom, when it was assumed that people, lay or ordained, did not need to know much about Christianity to be a Christian. The priests needed to know how to say Mass. The laity, at least the laity of the lower classes, needed to pray, obey, and pay. After the Reformation, as well as the Democratic Revolution, it was assumed that priests and laity should have some theological sophistication. The result, I fear, has given us the worst possible of the world. That is, the laity have little understanding of the Christian tradition, but believe they get to make Christianity up because what it means to be a Christian is to have a personal relationship with God. That's about the last thing I was Reduces people who believe or say things like Jesus is Lord, and that's just my personal opinion. Of course, that is oversimplistic, but it is a reminder that the question of the role of theology in the ministry will be a different question, and the answer will be different in different times and places. If we are living, as I believe we are, in an awkward time between the loss of Christendom and a yet undetermined future, then I think there is no question that those in the priesthood will need to be theologically astute. The burden of proof is now on us as Christians, and I take that to be a very good thing. In an awkward time, the temptation will be to try to attract people to be Christians who do not need to know what the New Testament is about by providing truncated and simplistic accounts of the gospel. Those who use such strategies will be impatient with theologians who then criticize them for being simplistic. When you are struggling for survival, the demand for theological integrity may seem to be a burden rather than an aid and support. In the world in which we find ourselves, a world in which the church has lost its ability to shape the lives of people who identify as Christians, it is hard to be critical of those in the ministry who seek to build their churches around what people think they need rather than what the gospel tells us we should want. The disposition of those in the ministry to avoid strong theological claims can sometimes even be found to be also true of those that teach in seminary. I once had a colleague who preached the closing sermon for the graduating seniors at his Divinity school. The sermon was organized around this piece of advice. They do not care what you know. They want to know that you care. So I'm a pacifist. I wanted to kill her on the spot. As a faculty, we had worked hard to instill in these students a sense of the significance of theology in the work of the priesthood. But just as they were graduating, they were told that the work they had done in seminary was not going to be all that important for the souls to whom they were charged to care. If what you know no longer matters, the ministry cannot help but be another helping profession whose task it is to attract people to church because of the appealing personality of the minister and the friendliness of the congregation. The strategies to attract the unchurched, and I hate that phrase, the unchurched, it's so complicated. The strategies to attract the unchurched through the manipulative practices associated with church growth advocacy, I take to be a desperate attempt to save Christianity. From my perspective, church growth strategies are but the gurgle of a dying Christendom. The church growth strategies to simplify the gospel for persons like the one seated next to my dean, ironically, is a version of the liberal Protestant theological presumption that the basic language of the faith is the description of our experiences rather than being about God. The only difference between the Protestant liberal and the church growth strategy is the latter tends to make a fetish of the Bible. The loss of an educated public for sustaining the work of the church has been long in coming, but it is now a clear reality. I'm quite aware that the language of educated public may sound elitist, but that is the description I accept, that is, elitist. Any organization that is morally serious must have a leader. The work of theology is done by people who have the means to recognize the elite that constitutes the church. The elite that is the first authority for Christians is, of course, the saint. It may be that sometimes a theologian will be a saint, but it's probably a healthy division of labor. The saints are called theologians. Yet it is the wisdom of the church, yet in its wisdom, the church sets some aside who are tasked with sustaining the memory that makes the church God's people. Yet just at the time when the church needed theologians to be agents of memory and linguistic capacity, theology became a university discipline rather than a church discipline. This mode of theology was given birth in Germany in the 18th century, where universities were founded to reflect the Enlightenment understanding of knowledge. Those who formed these universities sought to free the university from what they regarded as servitude to the church. Rather than serving the church, the university would now be the agent to develop knowledges in service to the state. In his great book, Protestant Theology and the Making of the Modern German University, Hauerwas tells the story of how theology became a university subject, first and foremost as a servant to the developing state and only secondary of use to the church. Of course, conflict of attack is matter text. The development of theology as a scientific discipline, deserving inclusion in the curriculum of new universities in Germany, such as the University of Berlin, was the great achievement of Schleiermacher. To be sure, Schleiermacher distrusted the state, but according to Hauerwas, he enlisted the state against the ecclesial influence as the necessary agent to further what he presumably regarded as the church's own highest interest, that is, the unification of the scientific spirit and religion, which was the best accomplished in a university setting. These developments were slower coming in the United States and Great Britain, but it was not long before theologians in both countries sought to imitate the way theology was done in Germany. According to Hans Frey, theologians now sought to show that theology could meet the demands of being an inquiry into the transcendental principles justifying all systematic methods and explanations. If theology could not free itself of its particularistic commitment, at best it would have to be relegated to becoming a practical discipline to train ministers who were ironically in Germany understood first and foremost as clerks and agents of the state. The effort to show theology could meet the demands of being a university discipline resulted in theologians focusing on methodological issues concerning the conditions that must be met if you were to do theology. Theology became one prolegomena after another that explained how theology should be done if they ever got around to doing it. Given these developments, theologians wrote far and were read primarily by other theologians. They may say and even believe that they're doing theology for the church, but now their primary audience was not people in the ministry. The transformation of theology into a discipline shaped by particular individuals meant theology became identified with the work of particular persons. Those in the ministry that took theology seriously might continue to be Lutheran or Calvinist, but their more important identity was as a Bartonian, a Bolmanian, a Philippian, and so on. The kind of theology was represented was no longer shaped by your ecclesial tradition of where you did your PhD. Years ago when I was at the University of Notre Dame, we were sitting in a departmental meeting. We described ourselves as an ecumenical department in a Catholic context, and none of us knew what the hell it meant. But everyone was sitting there trying to show their contribution. The Missouri Synod Lutheran, Robert Wilkins at that time, said what he thought being Missouri meant in a Catholic context. The Dutch Calvinist said what he thought being a Dutch Calvinist would mean. The Jesuit said what he thought the Jesuit contribution to being a Catholic context would be. And I was sitting there nervous. I kept trying to think, why the hell do I have to say this in Methodist? And finally, I thought to myself, the hell with it. I'm not a Methodist. I went to Yale. I mean, that's the way it works. That's the transformation. There was another alternative to identifying your theological position with a particular theologian. You could show that you were theologically astute by becoming an advocate of a particular kind of theology. Thus, you could be a process theologian, a liberation theologian, a neo-orthodox theologian, a feminist theologian, an African-American theologian, a contextual theologian, a liberal theologian, and the list goes on and on. The development of these distinct ways of doing theology could not help but frustrate ministers who thought they owed it to themselves as well as the people they served to keep up with what's going on in theology. To keep up seemed to require that one chose one side in the debate, even though it was and is unclear what was at stake in the debate. Equally debilitating was how these developments in theology could lead those in the ministry who continue to read theology to identify with what seemed to be the latest development. That meant it was very hard for some ministers as well as some theologians to avoid being faddish. Too often, I fear, ministers who tried to stay theologically informed found themselves moving from a theology of the Word to a theology of hope to a theology of liberation and so on. One can hardly blame ministers for finally giving up on reading contemporary theology. In truth, given the demands of the ministry, many who occupy that office found they have little time to read, and when they read, what they read cannot be what that intellectually demanded. How can you read a theologian whose work attempts to provide an alternative to Kant when you've never read Kant? And there's just so much out there to read. Who can blame the priest or the minister whose time is already in constant demand for being unwilling to read allegedly the new turn in this or that way of doing theology? It would seem better to preach Christ and then crucified. Finally, what must be added to this bill of particulars about a relation of modern theology to the church is what I can only describe as the fragmentation of theology into autonomous disciplines. Theology, classically understood, is fundamentally exegetical, but now the study of the Old and New Testament is assumed to be a historical discipline. The theologian must now wait on the historian to tell her or him about what the Bible might say about this or that. Accordingly, theologians other than Barth seldom try to develop their position using arguments from Scripture. In a similar manner, church history becomes a discipline that makes difficult the attempt by theologians to use theologians of the past in a constructive manner. Perhaps even more frustrating for the pastor who desires to responsibly learn from the work of theology is the distinction between theology proper and the more practical disciplines that comprise the offerings of the seminary. For example, even though I'm identified as an ethicist, it simply makes no sense to me why ethics is distinguished from theology. The distinction between theology and ethics certainly makes no sense to me. If, as I've argued, most of theology is an exercise in practical reason. Perhaps even more problematic is the separation of pastoral or practical theology from theology proper. I'm not denying that there may be some pragmatic reasons to distinguish between theology and practical theology. But if theology is in service to the church, if theology is one of the ways Christian holiness is to be made a reality, I do not think practical theology can be separated from theology. In this respect, the Christian East understanding of the theologian as a person of prayer continues to be a challenge to the dominant form of theology developed since the Reformation. Of course, theologians in the West may pray, but they do not necessarily do theology itself as a form of prayer. I think we quite literally do not know how that is to be done. I feel sure, however, we may have much to learn from the traditions of Eastern Christianity that combines prayer and rigorous analytic and argumentative skills. I've just described what I take to be some of the problems raised by questions about the place of theology in the priesthood in our time. But I am a theologian. I am a theologian, moreover, who has assumed I'm beholden to people who go to church, as well as those that serve the people that go to church. I've tried to write for both audiences, but I've never liked or approved of the characterization of theology in the laity as popular. To write in an accessible way is not to write to be popular. To write in a manner that can command the attention of a reader is quite simply to know how to write well for a particular set of readers. Christian theologians are particularly fortunate because, unlike other academics who can write only for other academics, we have readers obligated to read what we write. They're called Christians. I can't tell you what the blessing is in modern universities that Christians are supposed to read theologians. Otherwise, you're just writing for other academics. The theologians, like the Christians, make the distinction between academic and popular writing problematic. It may be true to write for laity is different than writing for priests. Priests and ministers have been to seminaries, which usually means they have some sense of where some of the bodies are buried. Going to seminary is a good thing on the whole, as I assume it's one of our last places the church has to catechize. But it's been my experience that many people who come to seminary may say they're there to prepare for ordination, but in fact they're trying to find out what Christianity is about and whether they want to be Christian. I do not think that is a bad thing, because many do discover, in spite of the fragmented curriculum they endure, that they do want to be Christian and even discover that they're called to God through ministry. Priests and ministers, moreover, spend most of their life in church. After all, they get paid to go to church. That is not meant as a criticism. I get paid to do theology. I get paid for what I love to do. Some may find it odd that some of us get paid for being a theologian, but that's the way the world is. At least that is the way I found the world, and I see no good reason to change it. At least by being paid, some form of accountability may be possible. I've written for Christians, and hopefully for those who are not Christians, but interested. But most of the Christians for whom I've written are students. Moreover, many of them are people who have, or at least have plans to go into ministry. Accordingly, I've tried to teach them how to see how extraordinary their task as ministers is. That is why I've taught the basic course in Christian ethics around the liturgy. I organized the course around the liturgy because I wanted to show the students who would spend their life leading the Christian people in worship, what a radical thing that is. That is to be set aside, to do nothing but to provide and do. I was also trying to defeat presumption that you have to choose between the unhappy alternative of being a minister or priest concerned primarily with worship and are a social activist who strikes out against injustice. I call attention to those whom I tried to write as well as form through that writing has taken to exemplify my conviction that theology is one of the ministries of the church. I think something has gone deeply wrong when it is assumed that the task of the theologian is to find a way to make the language of the faith meaningful by translating the language that has allegedly gone dead into a language that will be more accessible to those who do not speak Christian. For I think it's one of the challenges before Christians today is to have the confidence that our language can and does do work. That is why I've stressed that one of the essential tasks of the theologian is to teach. It is to teach Christians how to speak Christian. The whole language of translation is just corrupt. How do we translate these words into intelligible speech? Translate them. You can't translate these words into other speech. Always give an example. If I call Rob right now an asshole, you would think it's a term of derision. Where I come from, it's a term of celebration after someone scores a touchdown. Way to go, asshole! So, terms of endearment, you know. Now, you've got to be a Texan to understand asshole. You've got to be long trained to understand the use of the word. What I try to do, and I'm a theologian who is not ordained, is to help ministers and priests see the radical character of their everyday responsibility. What could be more important than spending hours every week planning the liturgy and preparing the sermon? After all, there are better and worse ways to worship God. There can be reasons given for why it is better to sing this hymn in Advent or in ordinary time. I should like to think that the way I've done theology might help the minister or priest order their day. For example, I should hope that given the way I've done theology, the priest of a congregation would spend a great amount of time reading the Bible. Moreover, one of their tasks is to help the laity understand why they have a stake in their ministers reading the Bible. I assume that one of the challenges facing those in the priesthood and ministry today is the multiple and often, I'm sure, multiple tasks they must perform. It's all well and good for me to suggest you need to spend time in study. But Miss Smith has just had a heart attack and you must be with her. At the same time, you need to plan and carry out the funeral for a member of the church who has just died. There's also the meeting of the vestry to approve the budget for the coming year. What I take to be crucial about these diverse responsibilities is that you do them in a manner that you, as well as those you serve, can discern the difference that makes that you are a priest. You're not just another social worker or a friend. Rather, you come bearing the gift of Christ. Nothing is more important to the ministry than the ability to see all minister does is centered on Christ and Him crucified. Sam Wells has observed that one of the great challenges before the ministry is to have that center. The fragmentation of the curriculum of most seminaries, I fear, can result in the same kind of fragmentation for those in the ministry. A minister may exemplify in the sermon Bart's understanding of the word, but whose pastoral care is shaped by pillars. This may seem a small matter, but but I suggest to you it has deep implications for your ministry and the church you serve. That may sound rather boring. Are priests and ministers doing what they are supposed to do by just continuing to do what they are already doing? My short answer is yes, if all you are doing only makes sense in the light of Eucharist. Eucharist makes God present in a way that makes those who drink and eat the body of Christ an alternative to the world. This is slow work, but it's the way God has chosen to save the world. If rightly understood, this work is anything but boring, because it cannot help to challenge a world that is organized by speed. I certainly do not mean to suggest that everything we are doing as Christians is theologically justified. Rather, I'm suggesting that one of the offices of theology for those in the priesthood is to help make articulate the significance of what you do. Ministers and priests should be the most political of animals, because in contrast to much of what passes as politics in our time, those in the ministry cannot help but be about the formation of people who can know they need one another to survive. To ask those in the ministry to take seriously their political responsibility may well entail a radical reorientation of what they in the ministry do. But it's particularly true if you believe, as I do, we're living at the end of Christendom. If there's been a center to my work, it is exemplified by the following sentence. In the shadows of a dying Christendom, the challenge is how to recover a strong theological voice without that voice betraying the appropriate fragility of all speech, but particularly speech about God. Let me read that for you. In the shadows of a dying Christendom, the challenge is how to recover a strong theological voice without that voice betraying the appropriate fragility of all speech, but particularly speech about God. That sentence is meant to suggest that there is a connection between what Iris Murdoch has described as our having suffered the general loss of concept and the end of Christendom. Murdoch's hour is not specifically meant to include Christendom, but we are surely not excluded because we are Christians. I suspect that one of the concepts Murdoch thinks has been lost is God. To suffer the general loss of concept invites the introduction of some of the most complex issues in the philosophy of language and philosophical psychology, but nonetheless are crucial for the future of theology and theology's service to the ministry. For example, the relation between a word and a concept is a question that needs exploration if Christians are to be witnesses to what we believe God has done in Christ. To grasp a concept, say a concept like a human being, is not simply a matter of knowing how to group things under the concept. Rather, to use Corradina's formulation of the matter, to grasp a concept is to be able to participate in life with concept. When a concept loses its meaning, it means the narrative in which the concept did work is no longer in work. To be sure, as Hans Fry suggests, concepts are verbal skills, but as such, these skills do not exist in some mental storytelling apart from the way in which they are applied. To know the words of a specific language is to know how to use them appropriately or apply it in the specific context of the language. Fry observes, communal Christian self-description demands knowing how to use words like faith, hope, and love in terms of how they were learned in worship and the formulation of Christian identity. If we have lost our concept from Fry's perspective, it means we have lost our ability to say as Christians what we mean. In his book, Language Lost and Found, on Iris Murdoch and the Limits of Philosophical Discourse, Nikolai Forsberg developed an account of what it means to lose one's concept that helps us better understand diamond and pride. Forsberg suggests that one way to make sense of Murdoch's claims about the loss of concepts is to see that no concepts are completely lost, but they may well be slumbering, forgotten, or repressed. What Murdoch is trying to get, Forsberg argues, is that aspects of the concepts he wants to reawaken are in some sense already in place, but we fail to notice that they are doing some work. Our failure to see the work our concepts are doing is often the result of theoretical positions that hold us captive, but we fail to notice that they do so. According to Forsberg, Murdoch is intent on making clear to us that we're not in command of our language now, and that that fact that these regions of our language are lost on us means we have disabled our possibilities of self-reflection and self-understanding. Murdoch is quite simply suggesting that our fundamental problem is we do not understand the languages we use. In a similar way, Richard Kleinman argues it is no easy thing to find ourselves in the complexity of the systematic order of our words, the words we share. Which is but a way to say we're never free of failing to mean what we say. We're never free of failing to mean what we say. That is why we rightly have the sentence in our language, what I really meant to say. That the words we use are not our words means we in fact often lose control over what we mean when we use them. Writing, which is one of the crucial sources of thought, is the struggle to try to mean what we say using words not our own. We find our lives faded in the language of our ancestors, in the language we inherit from them. Hence, to understand what our words mean, we must understand what those who use them. That we do not have control of our words we use, I think is surely the case if you identify with that tradition of speech called Christianity. A theologian or priest does not get to choose what they are to think about. Better put, theologians do not get to choose the words they use. Because they do not get to choose the words they use, they are forced to think hard about why the words they use are the ones that must be used. They must also do the equally hard work of thinking about the order in which the words they use must have if the words are to do the work they are meant to do. To be a priest, to be a theologian, is to be in the business of word care. Theologians are people that are tried to help us locate conditions that will help us say what needs to be said as faithful followers of Christ. I've tried to suggest a recovery of the virtues as one of the conditions for helping Christians mean what we say. The focus on the virtues, however, requires a corresponding politics that makes the identification of the virtues as well as the formation by those in the virtues possible. One of the reasons Christians have lost our concept is because we have failed to understand how our speech has been distorted by our assumption that the church is or should be subordinate to liberal democratic regimes. Accordingly, the words we use often cannot do the work they should do because they have been extracted from the politics required for them to do the work that they should do. Think, for example, how the public-private distinction works to underwrite the presumption that the Christian faith is primarily about individual subjectivity. Trying to sell Christianity on the basis that it gives your life meaning is just is just underwrite presumption that your narcissistic self-fascination in yourself makes sense. I don't. Christianity is about far more than giving your life meaning. Giving your life meaning is what? The grace is just a form of bourgeois ideology enshrined in the work of Paul. Put differently, Christians have lost our concept because we've lost the story that is necessary for our concept to work. The loss of that story, the story of God's calling of Israel and the story of Jesus that was confirmed by the work of the Holy Spirit in the creation of the church, has meant we have not been able to discern on which stories our concepts depend. It is surely the case that Christians have the most entertaining stories possible. It is a narrative about all that is that should captivate the imagination of any of God's creatures. Yet for a complex set of reasons, we have been talked out of the story by the presumption that people are no longer prepared to take the time to listen to a story in the complex but fascinating plot. At least one of the tasks of the theologian is to remind Christian people that we are fundamentally stories. My way of putting it that is the story of modernity is a story of the attempt to produce people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. The story of modernity is to produce people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. That's called freedom. It is produced, its fundamental agent is the university, which is meant to taught people, teach students that they should be alienated from whatever background their parents represent. It's called liberal arts. And if you don't believe, the story, if you got no story except the story you chose and had no story, it's the story that shaped us. I can illustrate this way. Do you think you ought to be held responsible for decisions you made when you did not know what you were doing? No, most of us don't think we should be held responsible for decisions we made when we did not know what we were doing. The only difficulty is that presumption, of course, is to make marriage unintelligent. How would you ever know what you were doing when you promised lifelong anonymous fidelity? That's the reason why the church requires you to have your vows witnessed by the congregation, namely people that's going to hold you to promises you made when you did not know what you were doing. And if it makes marriage unintelligible, we'll try having children. You never get the ones you want. And the result is that having children is just, Heideggerian, willful. Then, as a matter of fact, I think the only thing that's been justified is that you have quality time with Carol. Now, of course, as Christians, we believe that we should not have. We should not be people who believe we should have no story except the story because we have no story. Because we are stories. We're creatures. And it takes a good deal of discipline to learn that. The account of the theologian's work I've just given, that is, a teacher speech, can lead to a serious misunderstanding. The theologian may, on my account, appear to be a perpetual scold or critic. He or he may seem to be an observer of the church and her ministry ready to pronounce on any kind of unfaithfulness. Given God's good care of God's creation, I assume that even a theologian might, in some circumstances, be prophetic, a critic of the church, but that is not the primary task. Rather, the theologian's task is to join with those who are charged with the responsibility of helping God's people be a witness to the God that would have us say faithfully and truthfully what we do not know. The relation between the theologian and the ministry is not one of an intellectual to a non-intellectual, but rather of people who share a common task because we worship the same God. I need to make one last point before trying to make all of this more concrete. I strongly insisted that theology is a practical discipline in service to the church. That does not mean, however, that there's not a proper place for the theologians to do work that is not easily accessible to those who, for example, have no background in philosophy. The church set aside some to read what everyone does not need to read to be a Christian. You do not need to read Plato or Kant to be a Christian. It's not a bad idea for anyone to read Plato or Kant. It's just not necessary if you want to follow Christ. But someone in the church should be charged with the responsibility of reading Plato or Kant. They should read Plato and Kant because Plato and Kant were such serious minds who did not disdain the hard work necessary to discern what is true and what is false. I fear in recent times many Christians who often sound quite smart have assumed that what is essential is an anti-intellectual position. Fundamentalists and representatives of various liberation movements often share the presumption that much of past Christian tradition must be left behind. Thus it is claimed that Augustine needs no longer be read because of his views about X and Y. I can only say such a stance is a death wish, particularly given the challenges for Christians in the culture in which we find ourselves. It's a deep anti-intellectual movement within current theological education. I'm aware that the discussion of what it means to lose our concepts and theology as a form of language acquisition may seem far too theoretical, even though I met my account of concepts to show how the work of theologians and the work of those in the ministry must be complementary. So let me try to be as concrete as possible by addressing a challenge I recently received in the form of a letter. It's a quite supportive letter, but it nonetheless goes for the jugular. This was a letter written by student Robert Swain in the seminar that Rod had been teaching on my work this morning. It says, Dr. Hauerwas, I'm an Episcopal priest in McKinney, Texas. Hard to read. McKinney, Texas, and we met at Swanee last summer when you came as keynote speaker for the summer advanced Greek program. When you taught our class, after graciously answering a pair of those questions, you asked us some questions. You were interested in what we were facing in our congregation, and subsequently what kinds of things we would want you to write about. I was not prepared to respond at the time, but after 6 months, I know what I would like you to write about. Your theology is centered on the church and the way it is to be, but isn't. You speak of a church that is both real and yet unattained. Since I'm a leader of a particular congregation, I'm looking for tools and strategies to implement a vision of the church that truly makes the world the world. From your perspective in the academy, there have probably not been many opportunities to give flesh to your ideas about the church. But what if you wrote or edited a book that highlighted concrete examples of real churches that have in some ways embodied your vision of your theology? I would read that book. In finishing one of your books, the pastor is challenged by such a bold vision of what the church is and should be. But the very next thought is, what in the hell am I supposed to do with that? I would love to hear your answer to that question. I'm including a book, The Shaping of Things to Come, Innovation and Mission for the 21st Century by Michael Frost and Alan Hirsch, by 2 church planners who took your ideas and built actual churches. They never used your name, but your theology is obviously the foundation to their ecclesial perspective. I have also arrogantly included the paper I wrote comparing this book to your work. Your work has been a blessing to me as a Christian and a priest. I hope you enjoy your retirement in Christ. The book, the writer sent by Frost and Hirsch, who happen to be church planters in Australia, argue that we need a revolutionary way to understand the church. They contrast an evolutionary perspective on the church with a revolutionary perspective that they call the missional church. The missional church is one that seeks, they say, to create communities in a post-Christian world that are united by common purpose and identity rather than doctrinal, liturgical, and hierarchical distinctions. Notice that contrast. Common purpose and identity rather than doctrinal, liturgical, and hierarchical distinctions. A missional church will be one that has moved away from the church as an institution and toward a church that is driven by calling. They are therefore quite critical of what they call a model of the church as attractional. By attractional churches, they mean those churches that usually have as the main focus an evangelical, charismatic preacher, teamed with programs to reach the young church. As an alternative, they want the church to be incarnational. Incarnational churches will be composed of Christians who seek to be an alternative community within the world. Incarnational Christians will be united by conviction that God has called them to partner in the work of the kingdom. A church so constituted will be a church more agile and flexible than the established churches. You may well find the missional church in shoe shops in San Francisco, serving communities in New Zealand, and pubs in London this day. Such churches will not need to meet on Sundays, nor will they have a full-time salary minister. They will engage God on their own terms. In his paper entitled Hauerwas and the Church to Come, the writer acknowledges that I might agree with Frost and Hirsch about the end of Christendom, but I probably would not share their view that an incarnational church is one that must contextualize language, worship, symbols, rituals, and communal life in order to be sensitive to, as they put it, and impactful in a particular cultural context. The writer has certainly got that right, and that I have little sympathy with Frost and Hirsch's call to contextualize our language and worship. But even more, I would find it hard to agree with anyone who uses a word such as impactful. To be sure, I have no reason to resist liturgical developments like the passing of the grass Vincent Donovan described in his wonderful book, Christianity Rediscovered. Donovan could be flexible because he had the weight of the tradition behind him, making it possible for him to discern how the passing of the grass was a powerful form of reconciliation necessary for the monophone to come to the Eucharist, united and in peace with one another. But that seems to be, to me, what's lacking in Frost and Hirsch. They sound far too ready to make Christianity up. Toward the end of the paper, the writer calls attention to Dr. Theodore Lucy's haughty dissertation written at the University of Durham, entitled The Ecclesiology of Stanley Hauerwas, Resident Aliens in the Concrete Church. The writer reports that Hawksley finds my ecclesiology compelling, but argues I describe a very idealized church that has little to do with the actual church. According to Hawksley, my church is a theoretical, not concrete institution. Hawksley observes, reading Hawksley reminded him that I have spent my life in the university talking about the church, so it's not surprising that my ecclesiology does not feel concrete or real. For example, I claim that the church should produce people who have a problem with war, but that's not happening. I believe the church needs to be distinct, but that's not happening. I believe the church should be able to produce people of virtue, but Christians are no more virtuous than people that are not Christians. So where is my church? But I think the writer is asking me to provide with examples. I've tried to do that from time to time. See, for example, my story of Broadway Christian Parish in the chapter, The Ministry of the Congregation and Christian Existence Today. The book I referred to earlier, that is a book by Thompson called Living Holiness, as well as its God's Companion, I think provides the kind of theological ethnography example of that is the kind that needs to be done. But that is not what I really have to say in response to the letter writer. What I really have to say is, what are you waiting for? If you think the Christian people should have a problem with war, you need to think about how to preach that. If you think the church needs to be distinct, what does that mean for how you budget? If you think the church needs to offer people more eternity moral formation, what does that mean for youth groups? Rather than despair in the face of the challenges facing the church, those very challenges should instill in us an enthusiasm for what good work God has given us to do in this time. Recently, I gave a sermon for graduates at the seminary in Southwest in Austin, Texas, and the Shoda House in Wisconsin. I became for a year of a commencement sermonizer at the seminary. At the seminary in the Southwest, I told the graduates that after a lifetime in ministry, when asked why they did it all, they would have to say they faithfully went about their priestly duties because when everything is said and done, it's true. When we Christians have to say about the world, it's true. At the Shoda House, I directed their attention to what a wonderful thing it is for them to be priests because it has given them something to do. What they have been given to do is not given just for their lives to be busy, so they will not have to reckon with the emptiness that so threatens all of us, who therefore cannot remain still. No, they've been given meaningful work, that is, to lead the Christian people Sunday after Sunday in the worship of God. Finally, that is what theologians owe the church. What we owe the church is the reminder that when all is said and done, it's about God. If we forget that, then it surely means it's all smoke and mirrors, signifying nothing. But it is not smoke and mirrors, because how else can we explain that when all is said and done, we exist only to be witnesses to Christ and Him crucified and resurrected from the dead. If we've lost our concept, we have done so because we are living lives that make sense even if Jesus was not raised from the dead. But He was raised. It is a happy obligation of the theologians to never let us forget that Jesus' resurrection has all the difference for why we have a church and the ministry for those called to serve in that church. And that is why we so desperately need those of you committed to the scholarly path as priests. That's what I have to say. Thanks very much.